Okay, so we're going to continue our study of Wilfred Owen's poetry by having a closer look at insensibility. So a few things to realise about this poem. First of all, the opening lines are a direct allusion to Wordsworth's ode, Character of the Happy Warrior, which has the following opening lines. Who is the happy warrior? Who is he that every man in arms should wish to be? And Owen actually challenges this idea. As we've come to expect from Owen, he really subverts this romanticized view of the experience of soldiers in a bitter, cynical way by confronting these ideas with his own ode. So this poem is an ode itself, okay? And an ode, just so you're aware, is a poem written with varied rhyme about a particular subject, okay, usually dealing with deep emotions. This poem explores the desensitization that occurs in soldiers in order for them to survive. So in some ways it's very similar to Strange Meeting. These men had to switch off, if you like, in order to keep functioning as soldiers. Owen describes soldiers as living almost like a half-life, a shell of their former selves, if you like. And they're unable to feel compassion for their fellow soldiers' suffering or their deaths. In fact, they have to lose their humanity in order to survive. Thoughts and feelings have no place on the battlefield. The soldiers must dull themselves. And this is something we see recur in Owen's poetry as well. And perhaps, and in Owen's usual fashion, he saves his most critical comment for those at home who were ignorant enough perhaps to support the war in this blind quest for national glory, as well as the generals who then ordered these men into battle without really thinking anything of it. So let's have a look at the poem a little bit more closely now. Okay, so first of all, the title. The word insensibility really means to have no feeling whatsoever. So it really doesn't have any connotations of good or bad, it's just the lack of feeling, okay, and would suggest really a numbness. Each part of this poem is actually separated into chapters, if you like, or different perspectives that are Owen is exploring, and we'll see what each of those actually alludes to as the poem goes on. So in the first two lines, happy are men who yet before they are killed can let their veins run cold. We have a word inversion being used here. Owen is actually really sarcastic as he mentions the joy of these soldiers, and that sarcasm comes from that allusion to Wordsworth that I mentioned earlier. So the joy of these soldiers before their death, so they're unable to feel anymore. There's an ironic metaphor used in this second line. So the soldiers are emotionally numb to the war experiences even before they've actually died. So their veins run cold, okay? As we know, warm blood flows through our veins and our arteries and keeps us alive. But here these men metaphorically don't feel that same sense of life anymore. Okay, so in this line here, fleers means mocking or jeering. So again, these soldiers are no longer able to even feel compassion. In fact, the idea of feeling anything, or especially feeling sorry or sympathy for other soldiers, is almost a mockery of their existence. And these final two lines, or makes their feet sore on the alleys cobbled with their brothers, acts as a metaphor. So these men's feet are no longer pained by their marching. And if you think back to the opening of Dolce, there are really strong connections between the two here. Even over the metaphorical bodies of their fellow soldiers. Okay, they're now immune to this pain, the physical and the psychological. Okay, they feel nothing. This is the connection back to the title of the poem. Okay, and if we think about what these alleys might represent, they might actually be standing in for trenches. Okay, the second part of the first chapter, if you like, the front line withers. So to wither is to shrink or to shrivel, and the men at the front are actually metaphorically and literally disappearing. Okay, so the men are metaphorically in terms of no longer being able to exist as themselves, disappearing, and also perishing. So it uses metonymy here to liken the deaths of the soldiers to the death of plants act as a substitute for death. So we usually use that word withering to refer to plant life. And it's a very dehumanizing and collective image, if you like. Owen, as we know already, tends to take away the human aspects of soldiers when he discusses them. But they are troops who fade, not flowers for poets' tearful fulling. So here we have the use of alliteration, and Owen's returning back to reality. Okay, and he talks about that the fact that these losses actually demand more attention than what they're receiving, and more respect than just him sort of thinking about these losses in this most metaphysical way. He's suggesting that we should be doing more than just talking loosely about these losses. So men, gaps for filling. Again, those dehumanizing images continue. So the soldiers here are metaphorically replaceable, literally expendable. There were always more men that could be called upon to fight. And so this idea that you are simply plugging gaps, that means there is this relentless demand for more and more soldiers and greater sacrifice. Okay, so the gaps fulfilling actually acts as a metonym as well. And these final two lines, losses who might have fought longer, but no one bothers. So there's this real sense of almost like this futility to the existence of these soldiers, I think. Okay, so the tone becomes rather despondent, apathetic. The soldiers are reduced to these dehumanized losses, okay, rather than actually existing as human beings, rather than men. Okay, deaths are collateral damage, or to use those terms we've been using in class, cannon fodder. They act as cannon fodder and part of the war effort. So this links quite powerfully to ideas from the next war and from Anthem for Doomed Youth. So this is part 2 now. And some cease feeling, even themselves or for themselves. So these dehumanizing effects of the war continue, and they're shown here through repetition, that use of repetition of themselves. So they can't feel themselves and they can't feel sympathy for others. Dullness best solves the tease and doubt of shelling. Okay, so again that para rhyme links dullness to previous lines, so lines in the previous slides. And you have this sense that soldiers are actually better off remaining in this disconnected or dumb manner because they're not actually metaphorically teased by this everyday threat of weapons. If we think of poems like The Next War, where death was this constant companion, one way for soldiers to not be so afraid constantly would be for them to not have to think about the intricacies of warfare. The following two lines, and chance's strange arithmetic comes simpler than the reckoning of their shilling. As you can see, that power rhyme becoming more evident here, shelling and shilling. So chance here actually is personified. You can see that from the capital C, but the soldiers are powerless and they're under control of chance. So it's easier actually to consider ever-present death than to try and calculate the kind of pay or any kind of recompense that these soldiers might receive. And finally, they keep no check on armies' decimation. So dehumanizing image continued. It's actually easier for these soldiers not to consider the dead on such a great scale. So it's almost like this extension of almost like denial, I would suggest. Okay, part 3. Happy are these who lose imagination. They have enough to carry with ammunition. Their spirit drags no pack. So let's have a look at these 3 lines first. First of all, happy is used sarcastically here, as it has been earlier as well. And so you get the sense that Owen is actually challenging those ideas presented in Wordsworth's ode. These first 2 lines then, you have the third person pronoun, so these and they, and it creates that distance that we see quite often in Owen's poetry, thinking back to poems like Anthem. between Owen and the soldiers. And so here, imagination is almost symbolic of hope, that hope for a potential future of life after the war. But it becomes this sort of burden for these soldiers, a metaphorical burden. It's too heavy for them. They can't actually think about life outside the war. They need to think in those survival at all costs and instinctual ways. So Owen here is really creating a pitiful tone, and the soldiers are really overburdened by their thoughts. Okay, that metaphorical ammunition. In the next line, their spirit drags no pack. So any metaphysical sense of identity doesn't exist anymore. These soldiers need to stay desensitized in battle in order to succeed. Okay, in a lot of ways they need to switch off their humanity. And with that reference to spirit, you could suggest that that is a religious allusion to spirituality as well. We can see here as well, their old wounds, saved with cold, cannot more ache. And we have that word inversion happening again, and it is deliberate. Okay, the symbolism here of the cold, so the pain, the despair, is reflected both physically and emotionally. Okay, so their old wounds, these are wounds they've sustained in the past, but also causing pain in the present. Having seen all things red, their eyes are rid of the hurt of colour of blood forever. Perhaps my favourite lines, as students in my class would know, I like to pick out my favourite lines from each of the poems. I think these three are my favourites. So there's definitely colour imagery being used here to refer to the blood spilt in battle, and that idea of seeing it so often that it just becomes almost second nature. And the effects here of enjambment, of splitting that line, their eyes are rid of the hurt of the colour of blood forever, builds that desensitized image of the detached soldier. So now quite immune to the sight of really horrific injuries sustained by fellow soldiers, because if you see something often enough, year 12, it starts to lose that shock value. And so there are these connotations here as well of forever and that eternity of trauma. And again, we have that same sense or same connection to poems like Strange Meeting, and perhaps also to Dolce and the after effects of witnessing traumatic injuries there as well. This first line, so war is now personified as terror, and terror's first constriction over their hearts remains small drawn. So the ability to metaphorically suffocate the men is actually given to war in this personified example, and it's all consuming. So constriction does actually mean to limit someone's ability to breathe. Okay, and there's an emotive metaphor used in this second line and reflects how nothing will affect the innermost reaches of these soldiers any longer. So they're alive, but they're desensitized to their emotions. We have sibilants used in the next line. Okay, so there's senses in some scorching cautery of battle. Okay, and really creating this harsh image of those emotional and perhaps also physical impacts of battle as well, simply because of these heat images being used as well in scorching and cautery. Okay, and if you have a look on the right hand side, there's a definition there, but cautery refers to the sealing of wounds with flame. It's actually a way to stop the flesh from rotting, would be to seal it with fire and let it heal. So it was a really sort of basic way to treat gangrene in the trenches. Okay. If we have a look at the next line as well, now long since iron can laugh among the dying unconcerned. So iron, if you like, metaphorically, that the soldiers, if you like, have become that idea of shadows of their former selves. They're two-dimensional. There's no depth. There's no connection to others. There's no sense of them really living necessarily. There's also this sense of an emotional detachment going on here as well. So that continuation or an extension of that dehumanization that we've seen earlier. So this detachment of the soldiers creates this almost callous indifference. Okay, so they're no longer really considered entire men, I would argue. And finally, these last 3 lines, my apologies for the rudimentary animation, but these last 3 lines expressed a dehumanized image of these soldiers who were physically, emotionally hardened by the war. They're not able to feel empathy because they've cauterized metaphorically themselves from humanity. Okay, they're not able to function in those emotional ways that we would usually associate humankind as being able to function. Okay, but in some ways this enables them to survive, and they also likewise become immune to the pain and suffering of what's happening around them. Okay, so this is the end of the first half of the lecture, and there is a second half as well, so please have a look at that when you get the chance.